First, I suppose I should say I'm Stephen Blake with Children Now. I'm your moderator for the session. It is great to see all of you and so many of you that I've been seeing in these governance and support conversations for 12, 13, 14, 15 years. It's a pleasure to be back here again. But today we're very much focused on the research by two of these teams in the Getting Down to Facts studies. I'm going to give you a brief presentation on each of the two and then ask them to come up one at a time and address their studies. First, Dr. Susan Moffett. She's the director of the Alfred Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, and she's an associate professor of political science and international public affairs at Brown University. Susan's research focuses on American political institutions and public policy. She examines the politics of information gathering, distribution, and use, with particular emphasis on developing the capacity to implement policy in the fields of public education and public health. Before joining the faculty at Brown, Susan was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in Health Policy Research at Harvard University as well. Susan holds a PhD and a Master of Public Policy from the University of Michigan. Our second presenter will be David Plank, whom so many of you know and have known for many years, given his role as the director of PACE. In March of this year, David ostensibly retired from PACE, but I think we all know how retirement goes around this arena. So now he is a senior fellow at PACE. So David's research and teaching has spanned education, finance, and policy, economics of education, history of education, and the relationship between academic research and policy. Before PACE, David was a professor at Michigan State University, where he founded and directed the Education Policy Center. He was previously on the faculties at the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Texas at Dallas, and he served as a consultant to many international groups, including the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, OECD, the United States Agency on International Development, and some distinct foreign governments. David has received his PhD from the University of Chicago as well. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Moffett to talk about her paper, her primary paper in this set of studies, State Structures for Instructional Support in California.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. The key questions that our study has focused on are sources of support for instructional improvement in California. What are some key supports for those? What are the key challenges that they face? And what can we do as we move forward? I want to start with some of our main takeaways. And it also, I think, is important to begin that when we think about the capacity for moving forward, capacity is not something that just operates in the abstract. It's capacity relative to what? What is the task at hand? And one of our guiding assumptions in our project is that the last 10 years have put an extraordinary task in front of California teachers, with a combination of the Common Core state standards coming at the same time as the local control funding formula, all of this happening in concurrence with the Great Recession. We see that the expectations of teachers, in our view, is some of the most extraordinary that they've been in the state's history, perhaps the nation's history, in terms of the ambitiousness of the instructional demands that they expect, as well as the standards expectations that these reforms would redress inequities. So enormous expectations in terms of capacity that are needed. Some of our key takeaways in the context of these enormous expectations was a durable acceptance of standards and perceptions of their use, as Susanna alluded to in her opening comments. This was surprising to us, given the tenor of tension that has aroused facing the standards nationally. We did not find that in California. Also, Frontline's perceptions of improvement with respect to alignment, which I'll be talking about more later this afternoon, especially from teachers in schools that teach higher concentrations of English learners and children in higher poverty, but also real variation in how to put the standards into practice. So as I talk about capacity moving forward, it's always relative to what, And so my benchmark is relative to the Common Core standards and their expectations in California. And my comments are going to focus on limited state capacity, and my team focused primarily on the California Department of Education, though also we looked at some network forms of capacity. And we found this even in districts and counties with dedicated staff to support instructional improvement. What do we mean by limited state capacity? One was a dearth of content matter experts in the California Department of Education, real math experts working in the CDE. Staff reductions have also been more pronounced in divisions in the CDE connected to instructional support. And the CDE faces real challenges attracting and retaining quality staff. One of the things that came up in our interviews, I should mention that the data for this comes from a range of large and administrative data sources, as well as over 155 open-ended intense interviews and 2 waves of surveys. So something that came up in the interviews was the issue of state salaries. So our administrative data experts and programmers put this argument to the test, and sure enough, that is what we found in the data. We compared the top CDE salaries, top 5, top 10, with both county and district level positions at the same sort of functional position, and across the board significantly lower at the CDE. This is compared to counties, the top 20 highest enrollment counties, and this is compared to the top 10 highest enrollment districts, significantly lower. And we know from other research that economists and political scientists have done, when you have salaries the salary structure affects who you can attract and retain. And so this is not even in comparison with the nonprofit organizations or other kinds of education service providers, which also can offer content matter experts other positions. So that's one factor. But then also we encountered a real need for support in implementing and moving forward with the Common Core. And again, as Susanna mentioned in her opening remarks, and as our survey data revealed too, the frontline teachers' perceptions of improvement and alignment were higher among teachers who taught in schools with higher concentrations of English learners. That said, a theme that came up across the interviews was the need for additional help in materials, especially for English learners. Echoing the theme of we made great strides, but we still have a long way to go. Another area where we encountered, both through our interviews and then through our administrative data for additional needs, are the geographic disparities in California. So we also looked, we got a little formatting issue here. So the CDE is not the only source of support by any stretch of the imagination, and David will talk with us shortly about the counties. But we also looked at district access to nonprofit education service providers, and this is from our national database. We have about 6 million observations, and we just culled them for California and then plotted their distribution. And this helped us see areas of concentration where there may be access to more education service providers, and areas where there's we think of relative deserts. And then we did also the same, again, a little formatting curiosity here, with foundation grants going to individual schools, because that can be another source of support for instructional improvement. Here again, we see areas of density, but then we also see spaces where there is a lack of connection. But we also encountered in our interviews not just the issue of lack of access to educational service providers, but there can also be an issue of hyperconnectivity, or not even having the staff at the district level to make use of the services and supports that might be available. This is a representative quote from one of our interviews. How can you possibly be attending all of these different opportunities? You don't have a staff large enough to delegate or send folks. How do we get it out to our small schools? We invite California to keep this in mind moving forward, thinking not just about who isn't reaching the schools that aren't reaching, but also to have enough staff and support to be able to make use of those opportunities. This issue also came up in terms of the abundance of information that's available. So the space has exploded with materials in the Common Core era. And a common theme across our interviews and surveys was, how do we curate this new space? Again, this can also be a profound issue for our small districts. Put yourself in the position of the principal. These elements are not bundled or pulled together. There aren't cliff notes. That doesn't exist. But despite these problems, we heard a pervasive call through our interviews and surveys to stay the course. A lot has changed. A lot of the architecture is in place. Let's not rock the policy boat in fundamental ways, but let's continue to provide support so we can move forward. As this person says, continues to find the best ways so that we can improve. That said, there's a real recognition that, boy, do we have a long way to go. Even though the modal response in our surveys is a little bit of improvement, and this is statistically significant, especially for our teachers in schools with high concentrations of English learners and high poverty districts, boy, do we have a long way to go. Even just in terms of understanding what the vision of excellent instruction it means, it's amazing how far people are still away from that. Where do we go from here? We look forward to hearing your thoughts on how to stay the course in this current policy terrain, how to continue to build state-level support for instructional expertise, additional support for curating the terrain of materials, as well as how to span the geographic disparities in different kinds of learning needs. Thank you.
Okay, well, as Stefan said, I retired as executive director of PACE 7 months ago and then went on sabbatical. And so I've actually been not working, really retired for 7 months. Today is my first day back at work, and it's like being, it's not like wading back into your life. It's like being dropped immediately into the deep end with 250 of your best friends. So I'm a little bit stunned, and if my presentation reflects that, I apologize, but I'm trying to get my bearings back. Second thing to say is, and this is obvious with respect to the whole Getting Down to Facts project, is that time marches on. And that the research that I'm going to report today was done a year ago. I'll talk a little bit about counties and talk about, school districts also, but the data that I can report are a year old, and things have been changing in the meantime. So I think we really all look forward to the conversation about where are we now, because what we can report is where we were some time ago. So I'm gonna begin, and we were Susanna's here, so I'm sure she won't chastise me, but we were asked to stick to the data, but that's not my nature, so I'm gonna say a few things in anticipation of the data. The first one is that LCFF really came about in reaction to the accountability and governance system that we had before. Right? That we had, prior to LCFF, we had a very highly centralized governance system in California where, all of the authority basically was located within 6 blocks of here, right? Either in the legislature or the CDE or, the other agencies, and districts were expected to do what they were told. LCFF is a stark change from that, just a radical change from that, in that basically the control over the money, control over significant decisions was decentralized down to the district level. And I think many of us, when that happened, were, confident is too strong, but hoped that simply taking the shackles off of local actors would create the conditions in which they would do the right thing. Right? I think Governor Brown still has this confidence, right? That if we just let districts do what they know how to do, things will work out. And I think Governor Brown may still have that confidence, but I think many of us in this room have lost it. We recognize that, in fact, it's going to take some very active engagement from a variety of agencies, from the CDE on down, to provide the assistance that local districts need, that schools and districts need, to improve their own performance. That's not something that just happens, but something that really requires some state action. And I think the strengths and weaknesses that we see in the current governance system are, in fact, an artifact of that sort of reaction to the old system. That from a very tightly regulated system, we went to a very highly deregulated system. Now we're trying to work our way back to some sort of more effective balance between state action and local action. And I think so we're really in the process now of building a new system. That we had one, we sort of broke it down, or more than that, took it out of operation. We now have to put something back in its place. And that there are three big challenges there. The first is what is the structure of the new system? What does the new system look like? What are the relationships among the constituent parts of that system? The second is capacity. Where in the system do we find the expertise, the knowledge, the capacity to actually support improvement in schools and classrooms? And the third, and in some ways perhaps the most important, is culture. How do we get people to change the way they think about their own work, so that they are engaged in that process of improvement and not simply in either asking people to follow rules or watching people do sometimes the right thing, sometimes the wrong thing. Okay, but none of this is just going to happen. So I think, in the early sort of optimistic days of LCFF, we thought, well, yeah, this is so much better than what we had. It's going to be great. Well, no, it's not going to be great unless we do quite a lot of work. So the results that I'm going to present are a small piece of the work that's being done by the Local Control Funding Formula Research Collaborative. So Jen O'Day and Ben Cottingham and I wrote this paper, but we called on other research that has been done by our colleagues Dan Humphrey and Julie Kopic, Julie Marsh, and Magali Lavidence, who have worked with us on all of this work. And the main data sources are, the data that I'm going to present today are from surveys of county superintendents and district superintendents, but we also relied on interviews that have been conducted in other parts of the LCFFRC. Okay, so it's gone down, and Heap was called out from the platform as one of the key figures in this project, and he arrives ex machina to help us out. There we go. Okay.
I want that magic wand.
I think the first thing to say is that both among county superintendents and district superintendents, there's a relatively high, surprisingly high degree of optimism about LCFF. There are big challenges in implementing LCFF, but we see that they are cheerful about the challenges that lie before them. And so, they acknowledge the single largest response here is challenging. They acknowledge that this is not easy work, but then it's collaborative, it's complex, it's evolving, it's a work in progress. And you see relatively few responses that say it's tedious or laborious or otherwise negative. One of the key questions is how COEs interact with LEAs. The history of county offices working with their local education agencies has been primarily budget monitoring, so that they have been paying attention to how districts spend money, whether they're heading for bankruptcy, and with some degree of actually fairly heavy accountability between the LEA and the county office. We're now asking county offices to recreate themselves as support agencies. You know, that instead of just telling districts you're on the wrong track, you need to get back on track, saying here's some advice about what you could do better. That's a big change. And so we asked, has LCFF improved the relationship between COEs and county offices? And most of the county superintendents said yes. That they're seeing these relationships are changing and changing in positive directions, and that LEAs do come to the county offices for the kinds of assistance they need as they implement LCFF. Which of the following statements do you agree with most? I won't read through these all, but basically the question here is, should county offices be one-stop shops for districts that need help? And to make an editorial comment, I mean, it's sort of a quixotic ideal that you would build all of the capacity that your districts need into one operation. But about 40% of county superintendents think yes, that they just ought to come to us and we'll help them. That would be nice, but that's probably not going to happen. And then the other 60% say, in fact, either we'll develop our expertise in one or two particular areas and help whoever comes to us, or we're going to outsource this entirely, that we're going to find the sources of expertise that we need and send our local districts to them. Moving from a status as a sort of compliance-focused organization to an organization focused on continuous improvement, at least a priori, in the view of an outsider or of a researcher, requires a lot of change. So we asked, how much change have you made as you make this switch to implement LCFF? And slightly less than half of the county offices said they've made big changes, that they have reorganized themselves to pursue a new mission. Half say, well, we moved a few people around and we sort of probably gave people new titles and asked them to do some slightly different things. And 7% said, well, we're fine. We're good at this already. So, and that we asked then, how helpful have, and I talked a moment ago about the system, about the structure, right? The system of support, and I think we'll have ample opportunity to talk about this in the next few minutes. The system of support includes a variety of actors. It includes the California Department of Education, the CCEE, county offices of education, CCESA, and a variety of private, nonprofit mostly, technical assistance providers. And one of the big questions about this system is whether those agencies can work together. And so we asked county superintendents, how helpful have these other agencies been in supporting you as you work on LCFF implementation? And I think the only finding here that I'll highlight, I think the findings are relatively consistent, is the negative finding around CCEE. And I won't, we can talk about that, I won't infer the reasons for that, but it's, sorry?
I'm pretty far back, but I can't see anything. Can you just tell us what it says?
Yes, okay, all right, well, so
Nobody else has the problem, you all have the same problem. It's very small.
Okay, sorry, that's, where's Heap when you need him, right? So the left-hand column is CDE, CCEE, other county offices of education, CCESA, and other agencies. And the question is, how helpful have they been? Very helpful, somewhat helpful, not at all helpful, don't know. And this is the number that I was emphasizing, which is 45% of county superintendents say that CCEE has not been helpful to them at all. Okay, that otherwise, and this is a problem, right? Because these are agencies that are supposed to work together. And I think this is also a moment where I will acknowledge that these are a year old, these data are a year old, and that there's been some work done to address this over the past year, and I think the situation has improved. These are data from district superintendents, not county superintendents. So how helpful has have these agencies been in supporting LCFF implementation in your district? Does anybody else have trouble seeing these? Because otherwise I'll just, there's seats in the front. I don't have much of another, I didn't have an alternative solution, so, but similar cast of characters: CDE, the County Office of Education, other county offices of education, CCEE, other agencies. Very helpful, somewhat helpful, et cetera. The important thing to recognize here is that the districts are calling on a variety of agencies, and they have found those agencies generally to be similarly helpful. So that they come to CDE for some things, to county offices for other things. That districts are much more likely than county offices to engage with other support agencies, particularly the nonprofits, so WestEd or Pivot Learning Partners. Okay, how many of the LEAs in your county need help with compliance with regulations, standards, implementation, strategic planning, community engagement, budgeting and resource allocation, targeted students, continuous improvement? I won't even try to read this for those of you in the back. I'll just say that what's important here is the contrast between this slide and the next slide, which is how much more support would your district want with these different areas of action, because they're quite different. Right, the counties say, well, they need help with community engagement. Districts say, we're fine with community engagement. The counties say they really need a lot of help with continuous improvement. Districts say, we know as much about it as the county does. You know, so, but then there are areas where the districts feel they do need some help, you know, those are once again sort of opposite to what the counties think they need. So there's still some disjunctions in the system. Okay, and I'll just conclude with, again, back to my more familiar mode. You know, perceived gaps in the system. You know, what's not there at this point, and I think we've got this from interviews. We've gotten this from other research that the LCFF-RC has done. First is a reliable source of vetted information about resources, tools, strategies, and technical assistance providers. Districts will go to their county, they'll go to the CDE, they'll go to their neighbors, but they don't have at this point, or did not have at that point, a reliable sort of source of information about where to get the best information. And I think that's really important. I think there has been, again, some thought given to that at least, and perhaps some progress made as well. Mechanisms for the accumulation, validation, and dissemination of learning and expertise. You know, as the LCFF-RC has said, I know, to many of you over the past few years, it's remarkable that California has made a virtual U-turn in education policy, has completely changed the way we distribute resources and authority within the system, and has made no public provision for evaluating what's going on. You know, and you know, so learning what's working, what's not working, remains an ongoing challenge in the system because there's simply no sort of public monitoring of what's happening. We're still in, you know, the well, it'll work out mode. So, the change from compliance to continuous improvement has not happened yet, but that's the culture piece here, and that is, I think it certainly had not happened a year ago. I think there's ongoing progress, but that's still the big challenge before us. Okay.
Thank you both very much. So this is 25 minutes from now. We're about to open up to Q&A for all of you. Just a couple of quick reflections on what we heard here. So first of all, let me just say that some of these charts that were a little difficult to read, I believe that we are going to be actually including all of these presentations on the Getting Down to Facts website, but you will see all of those charts in the technical reports that are listed under the governance section. So everything that you've seen here is going to be accessible for you as you continue to think about this into the future. So we've heard stay the course on these major reforms, that many if not all of our educators think that we're on the right path. There's great optimism among K-12 educators. That said, there's a need for a very careful and intentional approach to systems of support that are going to allow districts to be able to implement these changes effectively. We heard from David that there's not yet been that much of a change in that focus from the compliance-based structure, the mindset rather, to one of continuous improvement. There's a need to build the capacity to support instructional improvement through a wide set of organizations, whether they're county offices of education, the CDE, the CCE, private professional networks, county offices, and others. That at the state level, wherever it comes from, we need instructional support, we need expertise to support instructional support, to support instruction, expertise such as resources, tools, providers of technical assistance, and instructional materials, especially for English learners. And in particular, local educators say that they need a curator, that there's lots of material out there, lots of resources, but how do we know which one is best? How do we know which one is right for us? In addition to these specific forms of expertise, there's a need for support of change management to help districts actually make change itself. Finally, all of this is going to rely on multi-agency cooperation. There are a lot of positive things happening in the early efforts, but there are still a few challenges, as we heard. And in a fascinating set of dichotomies in both of these studies, you'll see that counties and districts in particular, let alone other people involved in the education enterprise, see the needs very differently. As David was pointing out, counties think districts need certain things. Districts think they're great at those, but they need help with other things that counties thought they were very strong in. So a number of challenges before us as we move ahead in this era of implementing our instructional and structural reforms of the education system. So with that, I want to open it up to you. We'd like to take about 20 minutes for just the questions that you have in mind for our two experts here today. And then we're going to ask you to, within your tables, and you're welcome to switch tables at that point in time, have a focused conversation on these three topics that we think would be very helpful to the researchers and to policymakers moving forward. And at that point in time, both Susan and David will be wandering the room in case you have additional questions to support your conversation. So with that, please, any questions? Yes, Glenn.
I guess the question for both Dr. Moffat and Dr. Frank, one of the things that strikes me listening to your presentation on the research, and you made this point early on in your presentation, David, is that we were collecting this data now, we might have some different perceptions. But I'm wondering, in terms of one of the points that you made, around the development of state evaluation and research systems, what you might see as a way that we could be getting more real-time feedback on work in progress.
It's a great question. California has a long history of not evaluating public policies, so that to think that the state is going to move dramatically in the direction of sort of systematic evaluation, I think is probably not realistic. I think that so I have two thoughts. One, the first is something that is really emphasized in the Getting Down to Facts studies, which is that we need a much better data system, and and honestly, I mean, you're from CDE. We need a different orientation to sort of the purposes of that data system. That rather than simply reporting back to districts, rather than simply sort of giving us an annual snapshot of what's going on, the data need to be made more readily available so that groups like the Getting Down to Facts group or others can use those data to help districts get better. So I think that's and I think we've faced some political headwinds on that in the past 8 years. Coincidentally, but I think that's likely to change under the next administration, and I think that would be a very positive development, is simply recognizing that the data that the state collects can be used for learning and not just for reporting. I think the second is that there's huge research capacity in California, tapping that, taking advantage of that, is an opportunity for multiple agencies within the system. Figuring out how to work more closely with California's research universities and research community to address questions that are of value and significance for agencies at all levels of the system, from CDE on down to districts and schools. But I think it really is partly a data access question and partly a sort of research partnership question.
And if I could build on that too. So in our interviews of superintendents, this is a stratified random sample, the problems of data timeliness was a consistent theme, not just for the researchers, but for the superintendents also. And in addition to David's points, I also want to make a case for just good descriptive information and not just evaluation. There have been some studies of state agencies and the information that they find helpful, and one estimate suggests about 80% of it is just really good, what they call landscape analysis or descriptive analysis. What is going on? Who is doing what with what? And then a much smaller percentage, 20, maybe even down to 10 to 5%, is evaluation, which takes much longer to do. And is often something you want to do. You want to outsource to have the evaluation done. So there can be a lot of value in really good descriptive work, and state agencies elsewhere can be really nicely positioned to do it. Something that other states are doing is something you could even think of it as like a Yelp for service providers. So not tight causal inference is this particular service provider reducing the achievement gap, but just to know which districts are using what kinds of professional learning opportunities, what materials are these, what schools. That information can be culled in real time and shared. And when you don't put the evaluation dimension on it too, that can sidestep some of the political problems. Sometimes this happens with the state agency in partnerships with NGOs. So the NGOs can be the curator of sharing information. It's just something to consider as we move into this space. There can be a powerful state role in providing the central support for this kind of information sharing. But some of that information sharing doesn't necessarily need to be evaluative. And I would hope that as we move forward in this space, that there could be more information about sharing about the providers and materials and services that schools are using, in addition to what we think of as the standard metrics of dashboard and evaluation. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Yes, Bill.
So on this curation issue, first, just background, there are different targets for a system. Some targets are the school district and how it affects. Some are individual teachers, like the subject matter projects or coaches. So let's focus on the district. There has been quite a bit of research, and it's very consistent, of districts who are trying to move from compliance organization to a supportive organization. Not just the state or the counties have to do it, the districts have to do it too. So there's some pretty good body of evidence from those districts that have made good progress along those lines. Most of them haven't. Now the question on curation is, can we isolate the 3 or 4 or 5 basic things that they should be looking at if you want to make that change, and then figure out a strategy of developing a culture where district students or academic officers buy into that, and the providers, whoever they are consistent. So this idea of coherence in the state system, but most importantly, the research coming back when we talk to people, they say the district's all over the map. Some people are saying one message, another group are saying another message. How does a district, one, shift to supportive, but also get a coherent message? So that's a curation issue. We know something about that. We have experience of people who did it. So what's your advice on how do you get that order? Who should be doing that?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. We'll both
Is that a
stance on
fair
that.
question?
That's totally fair.
It's the fundamental question, right? Is that what we're asking districts to do is to conduct their business in an entirely new way, and to reconstitute themselves as learning organizations rather than compliance organizations. You know,
And
and
we know something about what that looks like.
we know
what the issues are.
we know a great deal about it from other sectors, certainly, you know, and some about it in education. You know, that we do have some examples of districts that have made that switch, and even in California. But you know, we honestly don't know. I don't know that much about how just or let me rather than say that, which would be depressing, I'll say something different, which is that from many of the interviews that we conducted and reviewed in thinking about this study, the districts that are making progress with this are led by people who get it, right? So you get people who are reading, you know, Deming, they're reading, you know, books about continuous improvement, they're reading books about Toyota, they're reading, you know, they're on this, and then they go into their districts and they start to implement it. What we don't know is how they got it, right? That, well, yeah, you've got a leader who gets it, a leader who's willing to, you know, drive change in his or her district, but where those people come from and how you get more of them in a system, you know, where with 1,000 school districts and superintendents hired by school boards, that you know, if we had a lot more of those people, if the full sort of pool of prospective superintendents was people who are committed to this, then maybe it would happen. But right now we're relying on exceptional individuals to drive it in particular contexts.
And I wonder here too if there is some space to rely on existing networks to continue to push this forward. So in the superintendent interviews, when we were asking, so where are you getting your information? One of the largest categories is from other soups, right? You know, so it's the soups talking to the soups, right? That is helping them just now. Some important issues of instructional practice aren't happening at the superintendent level. They're happening at the instructional leader level there too. But still, even in that category, the largest source of information is teachers coming from other teachers, sources of information coming from other teachers. But I would invite us to think about existing networks, perhaps it's in the core districts or something like that with their data sharing, thinking about the kinds of, go beyond just the conventional data sharing, to think about if there's room to use that platform for also sharing on materials or sharing other resources. So some of that information is happening at the district-to-district sharing level. It's a tough space.
I think part of what you're saying, and just an example, Harvard Business School probably created more havoc in this country by a guy who came up with the idea that companies should be run just for the shareholders and not for anything else, not for the employees, not for the training and so forth. Similar type of thing is what is the orientation of superintendents or boards who can ask these questions, state school boards. What is their view of the superintendency? I think that's one place we could be working on, because that is a collegial effort, and there are places where you can affect that. So when you're asking where people come from, part of it is selling this idea of a supportive, and here's what it looks like, and here's the thing, and making that an ideological effort.
Yeah, and I would just say two things in response to that, Bill. The first is that's a state action, and that's a state responsibility, is to begin to get that message out to the local level.
Or,
yeah.
You know,
or AXA and others. The second is that it is a matter of curation, as you sort of started your question with curation, right? That the networks and you know, the sort of informal relationships that people have are random from the point of view of actually making this happen. If you happen to be next door to somebody who's doing it well, you might observe it or you might copy it. But if you happen to be in a completely different part of the state, you'll never hear about it. And likewise with the networks, you know, that some of the networks have really dynamic leadership and good examples to follow. Others of them are just social clubs.
Well, and the issue of curation also begs the thorny question of quality, right?
Right.
Because networks themselves are not unalloyed goods. You know, very bad ideas can spread very quickly through networks, right? And so a difficult political issue is what does curation look like? Who is at that table? And you can move it out of the political level to up at the professional level, at a nonprofit level, but that at some point questions of quality have to be addressed too.
Right, exactly.
Susanna?
So this discussion just makes me remember when New York was going through, if you look at New York City, they decided to decentralize and give the principals a lot more power. Do you remember when Joel Klein came in and they did that through networks, through New Visions or whatever it
Right.
was that gave supports, but they also put in a training program for principals who could who had the mindset in some way to take control of things. I wonder if some of that similar thinking, what do you think about whether the kind of work that large districts did to turn themselves into portfolio schools or whatever you think of, that can be pulled back to the state level in terms of the kinds of supports that like high functioning districts gave to schools to try to get them to be able to take more control over their decisions?
So I think in order for decentralization to work, you need to have quality all the way. You really need to understand instructional improvement at every level. And so to be able, I'm not sure if this is getting at your question, but if I think the message that came through loud and clear is full steam ahead with decentralization, and it's thinking about what sorts of supports at a more centralized level would help decentralization work, right? And I think there is a lot of evidence in lots of different spaces how having a strong center can also mean a strong periphery also. And so to some extent it means having content matter specialists, instructional people at the CD who understand instructional improvement deeply. Again, the leadership in CDE has been great at articulating the need for this as well, but I see it as needing to happen all along the pike. Does that get it a bit? What you want to add?
No, that's fine.
Yes.
I'm curious about this culture change piece. We've heard some sense that continuous improvement is a dramatic change in California. It will take time. We've also heard the question of how do you attract or build leaders that get it. I wonder a different angle of that question. Are there barriers or obstacles you see, whether at the state agency level or whether at the local level, that get in the way of moving in that direction?
Yeah. Yes. Just one that's baked in, right? Is that the county offices, in my view, I mean, it's no secret, are the center of this system. It has to work through them or it's not going to work. But they're in an ambiguous status with regard to their constituent districts, right? On the one hand, they are compliance agencies. They look at their budgets, they look at their LCAPs, they tell them this is okay, this is not okay. They, have the power to sanction them if they don't, sort of follow the rules. On the other hand, they're supposed to be support agencies, which is not, you did it wrong, you have to fix it, but here's how you might get better, right? That's really hard to reconcile. That's just, it's just a fundamental problem in the way the system operates. And that runs up and down the system, right? That as other agencies, whether it's CCE doesn't have a history of compliance, so they're exempt from this, but CDE or the district itself for that matter. All of the parts of the system were sort of weaned on compliance. That was their modus operandi. And now suddenly they're being asked to do something quite different. And so it's partly a question of learning, right? It's partly a question of how do you learn to do this? What models do you imitate? Where are the examples of successful continuous improvement? But it's also a process of unlearning. how do you stop doing the things that are preventing you from being successful in supporting improvement? And so that's not the work of a day, right? That's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's a process that's going to take some time. And, you know, I think we're making progress, but it's going to take time, as Susan and everybody else has said today.
Right.
We got a long way to go.
Right, and I agree entirely with David here on the need for both learning and unlearning. Sometimes we just focus on the learning part and give unlearning short shrift. But I also wanted to mention there are a couple of different dimensions of the culture challenge, and shifting from compliance to improvement or continuous learning. And one of it is, you know, different kinds of skills. It's a different kind of skill set, right, to do compliance as opposed to instructional support. But there's also a time question. And when you're in compliance mode, it's the gas that expands to fill the space, right? It's a bottomless pit of paperwork. And so it's both having the time and the skills needed for that. Some places have pulled the compliance piece out and separated it and have instructional support as something distinct. So the relationship from, you know, moving forward is just of a different orientation. The organizational challenge with that, of course, is then you have coordination issues, right? So you need to make sure that the compliance team is saying the same thing as the instructional support team when they emerge at the district level. But it is both an issue of skill and time, all bundled into organizational considerations.
Great. Thank you both very much.